Welcome to Conservationists Without Borders, lessons from our international and national partners. This is the fourth of the California Landscape Stewardship Network 7-part summer series. Today we're joined by an amazing panel from across the state and across the country. Each panelist's stewardship and conservation work occurs at various scales, from regional to international, and each has unique experiences and insights with this work. And I'll introduce each of them shortly. For those of you not familiar with the California Landscape Stewardship Network, we're a diverse range of landscape stewardship partnerships who have come together across the state to facilitate peer exchange, share best practices and tools, build awareness, grow relationships, and promote priorities and innovation amongst landscape stewardship practitioners and colleagues throughout the state of California. As all of us gathered here know, the world we once knew has erupted. Hence, we're doing this virtually. It erupted with a global pandemic and demands to end social injustice, specifically anti-Black racism. And while it has changed the way we interact and connect with each other in this moment, I believe there's great power in networks to help maintain social and professional connections, especially during this tumultuous time. My name's Sharon Farrell, and I lead the Project Stewardship and Science programs at the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy in the San Francisco Bay Area. I facilitate the California Landscape Stewardship Network, and I will be your moderator for today's panel. I engage in landscape stewardship work at multiple scales, at a regional place-based level with the Wantam Partnership in Marin County, at a statewide scale to advance innovation, systems change, and peer exchange with the California Landscape Stewardship Network, and at a national scale with the Network for Landscape Conservation. We're using this panel today to illustrate the evolving scales at which we're all working. We've brought these colleagues and friends together to talk about working at various scales and to connect them in conversation over similar challenges and how their work within coalitions and networks helps them amplify stewardship strategies, build collective vision, and broaden and engage communities in stewardship work. Each of these panelists that we're about ready to join has a wealth of experience and a history of innovation and bold thinking around finding ways to advance our field. Each are continuing to adapt their work within the natural and social landscapes that are changing day by day. We hope for this to be a place for exchange and inquiry and encourage you to enter your questions in the Q&A box. I'm going to kick off with a number of questions, but as we move forward, I'll go ahead and turn to your Q&As and be able to engage the panelists. So, for today, I'd like to introduce our panel. We'll start with Annie Burke, who's the Executive Director of Together Bay Area. Annie has been a part of the California Network since its early days and has been instrumental in leading so much of its communication. Next, we have Jay Chamberlain. Jay Chamberlain is the Chief of the Natural Resources Division for California State Parks, and he has been integral in thinking about how do we build stronger partnerships with state parks across California. Following Jay, we have Gary Tabor. Gary is the founder and president of the Center for Large Landscape Conservation. My work with Gary has been fascinating. He works at a national scale and he's known globally for the innovation that he brings to this field. Following Gary, we have Lisa Brush. Lisa is the founder and CEO of the Stewardship Network. I like to think of Lisa's work as our sister work to the California Landscape Stewardship Network, and she brings bold and creative ideas and incredible energy. And finally, we have Jim Levitt. Jim is the director of the International Land Conservation Network and the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I had the fortunate experience of spending a year with Jim and our international and national colleagues in a peer learning program that to me was foundational for so much of the work I do. So that's your panel for today. It should be an incredible conversation. And what I'd like to do now is turn to each of them and ask them to introduce themselves, sharing where they work, what networks or coalitions they lead, and then share something they love about the part of the world they live in and work in right now. So I'm going to turn it over to start with Annie.
Good morning, and thank you, Sharon, for that introduction, and to the California Landscape Stewardship Network for hosting today's webinar. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here, and if only we were all in person, this would be a whole lot more fun. but thank you for making it work. As you said, I'm Annie Burke. I'm calling or zooming in from Berkeley, California, which is part of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe ancestral territory. And I'm the executive director of Together Bay Area. We are a coalition of tribes, nonprofits, and public agencies working in the 9 counties of the Bay Area, plus Santa Cruz County, for climate resilience and social equity. And we work at various different scales, so I'm really excited for this conversation today. And as you can see from this picture, there aren't a lot of lines on that in that region. You know, the wildlife move in ways that they don't care who owns what land, and people move and go to parks and don't know necessarily who owns what park or manages what park. So it's really working across jurisdictions, across lines on the map, across different scales, I think is a lot of what we do, what I do, and I'm really excited to be a part of today's conversation. In terms of what inspires me, I want to express my love-hate relationship right now with fog. And in the San Francisco Bay Area, we are the air conditioner to Jay's heat. And so I guess I'm both inspired by it because it's what brings us the redwood trees and the cool temperatures, and it also is what's making us wear puffy jackets in August. Anyway, I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and thank you again for having me.
Thanks, Annie. I can echo your sentiment about the fog. So next we have Jay Chamberlain. Jay.
Good morning, Jay Chamberlain with California State Parks. And yeah, thank you, Annie. We appreciate the air conditioning up here in Sacramento, where I'm based. And I also want to thank the California Landscape Stewardship Network for convening these conversations, these important conversations, really, during these unprecedented times. I mean, so grateful to you for this connectivity at this time when we're so challenged at being connected. So the team I lead supports the natural resource stewardship and restoration of the 1.6 million acre California State Park system. And those of you who know that system know what an extraordinary asset it is for the people of California and really global biodiversity, truly. And you know, we have representative and outstanding examples of every major native ecosystem in California, at least at the broad scale. So from the rainforests of the northwestern part of our state to pieces of the desert, of all 3 major deserts in California, as well as many of the major forested ecosystems and about a quarter of California's coastline. So we, by virtue of our geography, we are part of many, many landscape networks and have really been working hard over the last couple of years to figure out what that means and grow the discipline. And so we're actively engaged in things you've heard of earlier this summer during these previous convenings, Redwoods Rising up in Redwood National and State Park, as well as the One TAM partnership that got many of this started just a few years ago, down in the Orange Coast in Southern California, connecting our one of our major parks with a larger network of stewardship properties, as well as, of course, the Santa Monica Mountains, the Lake Tahoe Basin, and the Santa Cruz Mountains. So we play that role geographically in many of these landscapes, and now we're looking to play that role as a discipline. So picking one of those landscapes is obviously an incredibly difficult task, but the actual landscape you're looking at here is in Mendocino County. It's a restored dune ecosystem called the 10 Mile Dunes in McCarricker State Park, the 10 Mile Dunes Natural Preserve. And we're going to talk a little bit about this later, why this is so important and inspiring. But during this time that we're in, we've seen both public use in these parks increase, but also we've seen nature rebound in some really, really inspiring ways that we hope to share with the larger network of practitioners. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Jay. I love that juxtaposition between the fog to the dunes. And now we're going to go all the way across the country, and we're joined by Gary Tabor. Gary.
Hello all. My name is Gary Tabor. I'm the president and founder of the Center for Large Landscape Conservation based in Bozeman, Montana, in the Northern Rockies. The Center for Large Landscape Conservation was designed to help advance the policy, practice, and science for the emergence of large-scale conservation happening all around the world. I began this work professionally 26 years ago and helping to found something called the Yellowstone to Yukon area. And the picture you see, besides the receding glaciers in Glacier National Park, is my receding hairline, as you can see now, or my pant leg. But this area is the crown of the continent, Waterton Glacier National Park, the first international peace park. It's a Bob Marshall area. It's an area I grew up with in the Adirondacks, is one Bob Marshall area, and here's the other one, the crown of the continent, where the Bob Marshall Wilderness is. And this area inspires me. Oh, there it is. There's the Adirondack Park. This is where I grew up as a kid. This is what, you know, for all of my summers, every part of my life since for the last 60 years, I've been going to this area has been a touchstone for my life. And then I went out to the west to Glacier, and then worked in Glacier Park, and then been involved in these landscapes, both Bob Marshall landscapes, for, you know, my whole lifetime, if you will. And it inspires me, it challenges me, and it is a world model for conservation. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Gary. Those landscapes that you just shared, especially up in Glacier, are some of my favorites. So moving further east, Lisa Brush. You're on mute, Lisa.
I'm Lisa Brush. I'm the CEO and founder of the Stewardship Network. So I started this work 25 plus years ago, and I'm involved in local collaborative conservation communities. We have about 30 of those communities around the country, and those collaborative conservation communities are working in a specific geography to care for the land and water. And just like everybody else has said, they're made up of all of the people and organizations that care for land and water in that geography. So it's one of the neat things of being able to bring together individual private property landowners, academic and researchers, folks from governmental units from all levels, from municipal, state, federal, and tribal levels, private contractors and businesses, students, you name it. And it's one of the things that is really inspiring for people to become part of one of our networks. One of the things that we also do with those networks, so you talk about the scale, is they're kind of eco-civic units. So the specific geography of them is decided by the local community. And so it's at a scale that's human and that works for people, but it's very much ecosystem based. And so, and they do all kinds of different work around on the ground ecological conservation and learning and engagement to help people improve their connections and knowledge. And then the neat thing is that we link them all together. And so they learn from each other, so that we get to learn from Dillon and Santa Cruz and the west side of the state of Michigan to the headwaters of the boundary waters, to all across the country. And so really being able to share and learn from each other, and then to support the people who are leading those collaboratives as individual leaders. And the Great Lakes, as home to 20% of the world's fresh water, is an absolutely inspirational place. And I look forward to you all visiting one day.
Thank you, Lisa. And I think as we go through this, you're going to see that each of the models of the work that many of the panelists do are different in some ways, but they're connected in others. So our last panelist is Jim Levitt. So Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sharon. Nod your head if you can hear me. I think you can. I am right now on the shores of Little Tunk Pond in Sullivan, Maine, right below Schoodic Mountain, if anybody knows where that is. We are about 10 miles north of Mount Desert Island and have everything that Acadia National Park has except for all the people. So the landscape that I'm going to talk about today is the landscape of the Ruta de los Parques in Patagonia, Chile. I'll get to that in a second, but I will reintroduce myself. I am the director of the International Land Conservation Network, which is a partnership of large conservation networks on 6 continents. We are literally a global organization at this point in our 7-year life, and are regularly working with people from Kenya to Melbourne to Beijing to Stockholm to Boston. So it's a great deal of fun. As Sharon said, I had a chance to lead a large landscape peer learning initiative last year that linked together colleagues from the United States and Chile. In particular, I had a chance to link Sharon and Greg Moore, who she works with at the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy, with some people in a brand new organization called Amigos de los Parques, which is trying to generate support for large landscape conservation across a newly protected 28 million acre landscape. So they hugely inspire me. They work courageously. They work with a tremendous amount of faith in the future, and they are literally changing the face of the map. So my hat's off to them.
Thank you, Jim. So you can see we have a pretty amazing panel today. And with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask a question, and there's several of the panelists, I'll ask them to go ahead and answer that. Because we don't have time, sadly, to go through probably the breadth and depth of all of the questions we would like to ask each of these incredible individuals. So I'm going to kick it off with one of the reasons we brought you here today is you all lead coalitions or networks or involved in them at multiple scales. And I'm curious, we'll start with you, Gary. How have your network and coalition partnerships helped you to catalyze change at the different scales of which you work? You work nationally and globally. And do you have an example you could share? And what scale do you feel networks can be most impactful?
Thank you, Sharon. First of all, let me say that our center, one of our things that we do is we build networks. So we run about 11 large-scale networks. Some of them are around an issue, some of them around a place, and some of them around an action. So let me just briefly talk about 4 of them. One is the Network for Landscape Conservation, which is a North America-wide effort, and we bring roughly 400 to 500 landscapes around the continent together to essentially build the practice and capacity for large-scale conservation. We also help support the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group, which has over 1,000 expertise members in 120 countries around the world. And we're bringing up the practice of ecological connectivity conservation, an emergent conservation tool that binds landscapes together. We also support an area now for 12 years around the Crown of the Continent, 22 million acre effort for the Crown Roundtable that brings all the stakeholders around one landscape together to work on that landscape. And then finally, we bring a group together that focuses specifically on advancing wildlife crossing structures in all domains. And you can imagine it's a wonky group that likes civil engineering and finance, but it's a key group to advance large-scale conservation because these things bind landscapes and bind people. The issue we find with these kind of networks, not only are they kind of diversified in their themes, but you have to figure out the energy to get people to network. You have to figure out the energy to get people to implement what the network says, because getting people to volunteer their time to be part of a network, then asking them to do something in that network is another leap. And it's another leap to sustain these networks. A lot of these networks are new, they build on energy, but it's the over time work that's the hard part. And one thing and as one example here, is that the Crown Roundtable began 12 years ago with 4 years of funding to bring people together. And then we thought when we lost the money, that network would dissipate. But what we found out is that there was enough energy and commitment to that landscape. And because the problems were bigger than the scale that anyone had domain over, that they needed to work together, and this was the right vehicle to do that. And so we saw the membership increase even though the funding decreased. And we're still scratching our heads with regards to, wow, these things really can last if you have not only the right network, but the right composition of people who are part of those networks. So I learned that networks are not only just about scale and what their focus is, but it's also bringing the right people who can sustain this work over time, and they get something out of it.
Thank you, Gary. And I really like you put a pin in the collective priorities, right? It's like the value add is coming from the collective. So Gary gave us a sense from the scale on, like the national and the, significant corridor. Annie, I'm curious from your perspective, you're working at a much more regional scale.
Yes. One of the things that I think of listening to what Gary just said and to the question, Sharon, is the difference between authority and influence. And that as a coalition or as a network, we often don't have authority. We can't make anybody do anything. What we need to do is create the conditions for people to want to do it, to help build the connection, the connectivity between people so that they want to be a part of something. They want to connect. And sometimes funding, as Gary said, is the driving force. It pulls people together, but I think there's a lot more, and especially in the COVID era, where we really want to come together to figure things out. I mean, there's so many complex challenges that we're all facing, and we're all making it up. There's no playbook. Nobody's lived through 2020 before. So we really need to come together. And influence, I think, is a big piece of that in terms of the work that I do, and I think my fellow panelists do also. One of the other things that I think about in terms of what scale and networks is about relationships, and that in some ways what I do at Together Bay Area, and along with my colleagues, is help build relationships between people who don't yet know each other, but who share a common goal or a problem or a geography. And we're trying to build those relationships so that when a shelter-in-place order comes down, we know who to call. We know how to rise to the challenge. We know who to ask questions of. And that really needs to happen at all the scales. Like, that isn't, we don't need to just have networks at a state level or a national or a regional. I mean, in some ways, a well-organized block, your neighborhood who has an emergency cache and has an email, system set up for whatever communication they need, that's a network. And so we need networks at all scales. We need coalitions at all scales, because really what they are is just a group of people who care about something, who want to work together.
Thank you, Annie. And I think about just the all scales, and so I'm going to turn lastly to Jay on this question. And with the state, I mean, you've gone through transformation over the last decade, and the state is really looking to build those stronger relationships, connect folks to be able to support and influence landscape scale stewardship across the entire state. So I'm curious, from your perspective as a state leader, how you might approach that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I really appreciate both Gary and Annie's comments, because I think that's definitely part of, I mean, obviously our network is so much, and how we communicate is so much a part of this new musculature we're building. But from a state's perspective, I think when we went through some really dire times, starting a decade ago or so, and thought about our future, we realized that we had a role to play as a convener. And that convening role can happen at so many different scales, and there's no cookie cutter for it. And so we really sought to be a little more deliberate, and frankly, we got very lucky with some very energized partners in a number of places at a meaningful scale, that then we could amplify that and begin a conversation in another place that maybe wasn't as scary for political leaders to want to invest funding, invest resources, invest time and energy. So just a couple examples are so important. For many years, Redwood National and State Park has been a conserved landscape since the 60s and 70s, since the late 60s into the 1970s. And we had instruments, in place, memorandum of understanding, but in truth, the National Park Service and California State Parks, even as next door neighbors, were often doing things their own way. And based on an example from another part of the state, as we were going through the exercise of transforming ourselves, we used the example of the partnership in the Mount Tamalpais area that had been so effective at building relationships and doing work on the ground, and asked the question, can that be applied somewhere else? And one of the key aspects there was just having a really strong nonprofit organization partner that could be the backbone and could help integrate and facilitate the conversation between the agencies. And we brought that model, and Sharon and many others really helped us take that model and see if it could be applied in the Redwood region. And now today, as those of you who heard the last conversation, we're celebrating breaking ground on a visionary restoration project that aims to do in the next 5 years what we've done in a generation from a restoration perspective, and has already mobilized incredible numbers of people, has mobilized a lot of capital, and is starting a whole new conversation about the scale we can operate at. So, taking something that was at the couple of 100 acres and now talking about it at the 100,000 acre level, that's something that can be done with those networks. And if we all understand the roles we can play and can capitalize on those opportunities.
Great. Well, there's a theme here, right? It's the power of connecting people. And sometimes that can be infectious and it can grow. So let's talk about impact. Let's talk about the impact of what that does. And how we communicate the value of and the need for landscape scale stewardship to individuals, to community, and to society at large. I was recently on a webinar with the Network for Landscape Conservation, and a panelist said, and it struck me, she sees advancing the cause of equity as being a better ancestor. And for me, there's an important tie-in there with the call for stewardship. Since we see stewarding the land as securing a vibrant and resilient world for future generations, right? And we're often challenged with how we talk about our work. So my question, and I'd like to start it off with you, Lisa, for this one, is if you're talking to someone a generation or two younger than you, what would you describe as the impact of our work? And how has that impact changed over the course of your career? And how do you describe our work to collaborators, to funders, who aren't necessarily as familiar with what we do?
Thanks, Sharon. And you're right, that I bet we do want to all answer every question. So I think it's a challenge. And so one of the things that I say is when I think about the work that I do, when I was in my 20s and I thought about what I wanted to do, I thought long and hard about it. I used to say I wish I wanted to be a firefighter or a nurse, because then, Jay, you would know exactly what I'm talking about. And instead it was something more ambiguous. And what I really decided was that I wanted to work with people in a hands-on way to connect them to their environment. And because I feel like when we're connected to the environment, that I think we're more grounded. I think we're more able to connect with people as people. And then the other thing, so I think the idea of connection to place, and I think that we all have that. And then I also talk a little bit about the problems that we're facing now. So these are wicked problems. They're problems that no one organization and institution can solve alone. And that if we bring the strengths of each of our individual psyches and people and brains and organizations and missions together, we can start to create collaboration that is really transformational in its impact. We just heard about those from the other panelists in terms of what those networks are doing. And then the other thing that I think about in terms of kind of getting it into the mainstream, I think that for me, there's a part of, there are so many things that are going on and that need help in the world. And I care deeply about women's rights. I care deeply about issues of poverty and equity. And I care deeply about housing issues and all those kinds of things. I've chosen not to work in those. And so I'm really, really pleased that there are a whole host of people working around the planet on these other issues. And so we here in this panel are choosing to work on those landscape issues and those connections with people and place. And I think what we can do is make those accessible and help people see the power of becoming engaged, because that's what I witness when people do become involved in this work. And as the person that you heard, Sharon, stewardship and equity are right there. It's very much accessible.
Right. Thank you, Lisa. Jim, how about you? When you think of how impact has changed over time in language and how we talk about our work?
Well, Sharon, it's wonderful you asked that question, because my niece is up here with us on this lake in Maine, and I had this very conversation with her yesterday. And I asked her, Kate, can you think of anything you can do that has an impact in perpetuity? And I was talking about land trust, something she wasn't familiar with the concept of a land trust, but she, having me as an uncle, she got familiar very quickly. And I said, we've taken some of the land that's right around this lake and put a conservation easement on it, and we've agreed with the United States government that we will protect it, and the land trust that we're associated with will protect it forever. I said, you can do a lot of things. You can write books, you can make fortunes, you can do all kinds of things in the world, but there are very, very few things that you can do that leave a mark on the map in perpetuity. And you could see her eyes get wide, and I think she got the point. One of the techniques that I use when we work with college undergraduates and graduate students is to try to have them think over time and over large geographies. Over time, what I really mean is that in the context of a democratic society, we've actually been protecting land for 400 years, since we first protected the Boston Common in 1630. This is not something that we invented in 1960. This is something that's been building up in our culture for a long, long, long time. And we now have the mantle on our shoulders and are willing and actually honored to carry it forward. With regard to geography, the other thing I like to remind them is that this is a global effort, and we have made tremendous progress, over the last 150 years. 150 years ago, when Abraham Lincoln created Yosemite as a state park in California, there were virtually no legally protected lands in the context of a democratic society anyway, of any scale in the world. There were parks, but there were no large national parks. Today, we protected something like 17% of the Earth's surface, according to the IUCN. And we're on our way at the COP15 of the Biodiversity Convention to aiming at protecting 30 by 30, 30% of the Earth's surface by 3030. So we are living right in the middle of a monumentally important time. So let's get to work.
Thanks, Jim. I mean, one of the things in just listening to Jim, right, there's a lot going on. And so Annie, I just want to finish with you on this question, because I think you and I talk a lot about how to make that, continuing to make that relevant, or how to bring connectivity to our work with a broad audience. So any closing thoughts on this question?
Closing thoughts. There's so many. I think we need a few days for this conversation. Yeah, well, I want to first give voice to something Lisa wrote in the chat, that there's protection, but then there's stewardship. And that also protection means protection from things as well as protection for things. And so we want to be careful, or articulate what we mean in terms of protection. But also that we need to steward and take care of these lands. And I mean stewardship in a very broad way. In terms of making it more relevant, is that where you want me to go?
Wherever you'd like to go with that question.
Is that, yeah, we need to do, well, one, I think of how many people around the world are working on this work. I mean, there's thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, I don't know. And that we often are not on the top of the New York Times website, or we're not, in the news. But there's so many people doing this work that to remember that there's a whole kind of movement to take care of our planet and to not lose sight and lose hope of that. And relevancy is really important. And I think we'll get to it. We'll dive a little deeper into relevancy in a little while, but it's a really big topic.
Thanks, Annie. All right, so shifting to kind of the here and now, right? The very fact we're on Zoom together is a reflection of where we are with 2020. And so I'd like to ask, and we'll start with you, Jim, on this. What are the biggest challenges and opportunities that you have had to address or take advantage of now in 2020? And do you feel that these translate across landscape scales, or are they unique to your work? So when you think about this moment in time and how you've had to adapt, are there things that come to mind, and are they specific to your work, or do you think with this panel and this audience, there are those that translate across?
I can think of two ways, Sharon. One is the pivot that we all had to make to Zoom in a moment. We were going to have for the ILCN a global conference for 300 people in Barcelona in April of this year on Earth Day, but had to reschedule that hopefully for next year and put on a 10 series webinar in the remainder of the fiscal year from April to July. And we actually, including our friends in China who attended, had something like 5,000 visits to these webinars. So we vastly expanded our reach, just responding as quickly as we could. That's A. B, I think that the power of GIS technology today, Geographic Information Systems, is giving us the ability to do stewardship of the kind that you're so eloquent in promoting, and land protection in a much more sophisticated way than we ever dreamed possible 40 or 50 years ago when we all started, some of us started in this field. I think of the Nature Conservancy's work to site wind power in the right places in the Great Plains so that it doesn't conflict with biodiversity. If those specific places are used, we still have in the Great Plains the ability to generate a terawatt of power, which is enough power to power most of the United States, just by staying to the places where there's no conflict with biodiversity. So again, the technology that we have at our fingertips is unlike anything that anybody ever dreamed of 50 or 100 years ago, and that should accelerate our work.
Thank you, Jim. And Jay, did that strike a chord for you, and what else does it bring up?
Yeah, very much so. But I'm gonna come at it from maybe a little different angle to the question about the opportunities in 2020. You know, we're having a whole new conversation about the importance of open spaces and access to nature in 2020 than we could have ever dreamed of having a year ago even. And that, I think we're still kind of thinking about what that opportunity really means and how to make use of it. But nothing is more apparent when you've been sheltering in place for months on end about how vitally important open space and nature is for our health. And that's just spawned so many other conversations that I think I want to wrestle with that a little bit. But I think, you know, definitely the challenges we've had to face is basically the whipsaw starting this year, thinking we were going to be continuing to advance the way we had been, conversations about climate, conversations about biodiversity and open space. And then now suddenly we've just had people see it with their own eyes, and we have an opportunity to narrate it in a way that we just had the conversation about stewardship. It's not simply having access to these places, but we have an obligation to be good stewards of those places so that they're available, and all of those services, if you want to call them that, are available to the next generation. And that is a responsibility that we own, and that's a conversation that we're having now and we have access to. And there was recent polling from the Public Policy Institute of California that really reflected a lot of awareness on the part of a large majority of Californians about climate, about wildfire, about the importance of nature, that I think I find really, really encouraging. And I think it's now to us to find out what to do with that.
Well, it was great, Jay, about how you answered that. You actually started the answer to my next question, which was, what are the conversations you're having now that you weren't having in January, and what brings you hope? So I would say, unless there's anything else that you would like to add to that, you did an amazing job answering that, and I can shift to your colleague, Gary. Is there anything else you want to add before I shift to Gary?
Well, maybe just one little thing, maybe just one illustrative example. I did enjoy the sort of self-segue there. That was kind of fun. But here's the thing: like just at a micro level, when we're thinking about scale, it scales because, for example, when we're having the public come to beaches where they hadn't been coming, that photo I showed earlier of McCarricker State Park, the 10-mile dunes preserve. Here's a landscape that we invested to restore some years ago by removing some infrastructure to make it more resilient to sea level rise, to climate change. And then when that beach was closed, we saw something else. We saw a repopulation, or we saw more nesting activity by a threatened species, the western snowy plover, than we had seen in memory. And we're seeing this around the state where, those important habitats are important. And, we've seen nesting all up and down the state. And now we have it crystallized a moment to speak to the public about these landscapes and their importance that transcends their importance as places to play volleyball or just get some fresh air. It's all these things. And that speaks to our collective responsibility in being stewards. So that's the final thought there.
Thank you, Jay. How about you, Gary? What conversations are you having now that you weren't having in January, and what brings you hope?
Oh my God. So first of all, everyone knows that we are living in a historic moment. What began in January as a genetic sequence of a virus shared to colleagues around the world would give us what we have right now with the pandemic has fundamentally changed how we are looking at so much. First of all, just managing uncertainty. We are now, everyone is just, if you've ever had cancer, and my wife had cancer, and you're in a period of uncertainty. I mean, you have to live. You don't know what it's going to bring. You just go with it, and you hope that there's light at the end of the tunnel. So, we're in a new terrain. Sustainability. A lot of NGOs, a lot of institutions are under a lot of stress. We don't know. We're just getting into the future of how we sustain our work. And we all know that there will be a post-COVID world, and what would that world look like? And we all want to know what's happening to the elections because of this, because this has fundamentally changed our whole decision-making structure. It's actually taken conservation down, out of the limelight, if you will, in, given that we have the social injustice, the pandemic issues, the economic issues, our message is being lost a bit in this. And fundamentally, what this has done is that the public health system, I've had a great deal of faith in, but seeing how our public health response has been and our leadership to this issue has been, it doesn't bode well for climate change, which is the next crisis that's coming right behind us. And I know you asked me for something hopeful, but what it does is essentially it is clear reality that we have to deal with. But the one thing that's been very helpful, and I don't know if it's like in any of the landscapes or areas you work in, maybe it's true in Maine as well, is that the number of license plates that are in Montana right now that are not from Montana is enormous. People have sought nature as a refuge more than any time as I can remember. They're flooding nature for the psychological benefits, for the physical benefits, for, hey, this is our touchstone for humanity. This is not just biodiversity. Our humanity is in these areas that are wild, and we can heal ourselves given all the other unrest and unhealthy elements around us.
Thank you, Gary. And you and Jay certainly share similar perspectives with that in two completely different states. How about you, Lisa? Do you have anything you'd like to add?
I would echo exactly that connection to nature. The other kinds of conversations that we're having now, I'm working on a report with a committee on the state of Michigan's groundwater aquifers, and one of the things, and so we're doing a report as kind of part of the final work on that. And one of the things that I suggested at the end was, let's take a pause and let's think about what voices we missed. We did a whole year's worth of work on this year plus, and who did we not listen to? Who did we not ask? Who did we not? And that committee might have, not in the midst of the Black Lives Matter and anti-racism, and understanding that we are excluding important voices from a lot of these conversations. And that committee might have said, oh, let's not do that. I mean, we're nearing the end. And instead they all said, absolutely, let's do that. And let's do that work. So I think that that is an important piece for us to be asking, is who's not at the table? And that gives me hope. That gives me hope that we are now having those conversations, and that we are all doing what I've all along said we need to do, is we need to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And so we need to have those really, really important conversations and listen, and that gives me hope.
Well, I'm gonna shift the order of the questions I was gonna ask you, because I want to follow the flow of this conversation, and it's the prerogative of the moderator. So thank you all for your patience and being comfortable with the uncomfortable. So we've been talking about COVID, and we've been talking about racial justice, and clearly it's top of mind, right? Each of you touched upon it in your own way as you've answered, your questions. And I guess I would like to ask you in this moment, like, how do you see cross-boundary landscape scale stewardship adapting to the changes that we're seeing right now, and even contributing to healing, right? Gary, I mean, you were talking about the healing power of nature, healing communities and landscape needs, and how? So Lisa, you were just touching upon that. I'm going to turn back to you and see if you'd like to elaborate on what you began.
Sure. One of the things that I think we've touched on it throughout this conversation today, which is that stewardship is accessible, and we as the conveners of these networks and these facilitators of these capacity building parts for the local organizations, local, national, international organizations, we need to help build the capacity to make this work even more accessible. It is by its very nature accessible. And then the institutions and the people that are part of them contribute to how accessible they really are. Do people feel safe in the space? Do they feel like their voice is heard? Do they feel dismissed? So what are all of those things that we need to do in order to create that safe space? And then I think, those of us who have done this work know the power of working alongside somebody stewarding land. There's nothing like it. It's a connection to place, it's a connection to people, and it's a place where you can have conversations that might be a little more uncomfortable, where you can listen to people's lived experiences. And I think it really does have the power to be transformational. We're talking a little bit in the chat about some of the ways in which it can also be job creation and some of that work. And so I really think I think there's a lot of potential for this landscape scale stewardship work to really be transformational in that regard, not only ecologically, as we're talking about, but also culturally, sociologically, and community-wise.
Annie, your organization has gone through its own transformation in the last year and a half, and I think part of what I've observed is this being a foundational piece to the mission. So I'm curious what your thoughts are, as how you'd like to build on this conversation.
Well, first, I'm surprised that we've made it this far and we haven't talked about the Land and Water Conservation Fund. I mean, talk about a coalition trying to achieve something across the country with a very diverse set of stakeholders, and that the Great American Outdoors Act was passed last week. It's a pretty significant achievement, and even despite all the things that are going on, that happened. So I just want to mention that and say that the coalition that helped make that happen is a really impressive one in terms of how they organized across the aisle, across the country. So yeah, Together Bay Area, we have two programs. Our first is Advocacy for funding. We want to transform how we work together and how we take care of the lands in the Bay Area, and want to catalyze that transformation through funding, which is often a good way of making change. And the second program is our Convening Program, which is a lot of what we've, building relationships, building connections across organizations and jurisdictions. Well, in January, we had plans for our Convening Program that included in-person, real spaces with catering budgets and all kinds of things. And then March 16th came, and the Bay Area went into shelter in place, and all the things happened, as you all know. And Jim was talking earlier about this pivot to Zoom and making, being on Zoom and being on virtual meetings like this and webinars like this became normal very quickly. Interestingly, it's made our work of convening much easier and much more impactful, because we don't have to fight with Bay Area traffic anymore. We can have somebody, in Santa Rosa and in San Jose who would take, on a given weekday would take 2 hours, maybe 3 hours, depending on what time of day to get to each other. We can now, pretty easily send a Zoom link and bring those people together. So between March and June, we held weekly meetings with the general managers and senior leaders of public land management agencies and with nonprofit executive directors. They were often just check-ins. Sometimes they bordered on kind of therapy sessions in terms of just sharing what's going on. And from those weekly calls spawned so many collaborations. Senior teams from different park agencies are now meeting on a regular basis. There's just so many things that have just kind of been able to be created because we removed the space, the space between us. So it's really game changing. And I think we should take advantage of this moment. Jay talked earlier about this kind of this moment, this opportunity. And I hope that we're going to push through it to create a post-COVID world that's more equitable, more just, and much more in tune with the natural world.
Thank you, Annie. And to Jay's comment about the power of convening, that's part of what helps create that facilitation of bringing people together around finding common purpose. And Jim, I'm curious what you're hearing at an international level. We've been talking a lot about equity, and justice conversations in the United States. As you're looking at an international scale in landscape conservation and stewardship, are these threads similar? Are there different conversations that you're a part of?
They're different, but they've got a lot of similarities. It's so interesting to hear these comments because I was talking with a colleague from Kenya 2 weeks ago on the phone, and I introduced him to the American quote that a good crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And he laughed and he said, no, actually, that's a very good point. And I think that of the many, many things that need healing, the system of international collaboration that the United States helped to build since World War II is in tremendous need of healing. And landscape stewardship, landscape conservation is a language that translates very easily from New Zealand to Finland to Bolivia to wherever you want. Everybody gets it after a very short conversation, and I think that there's a tremendous thirst after all of this craziness to actually get back to work and start making progress on this movement that we're all part of. I want to liken it to renewable energy, which I did by reference before. 5 or 10 years ago, the idea that photovoltaics and wind could overtake the global coal industry was a complete pipe dream. And today, for a variety of reasons, economic and political, it's happening right in front of our eyes because a bunch of people just never gave up on it and because the economics were favorable for it. I think similarly, especially Sharon, the stewardship collaboration that you champion has its moment either now or coming very soon, where we're going to see the same kind of movement given a little bit of breathing space.
Thank you. So this is going to be a question I'm going to ask each of you. And then if we have some time, I'm going to come back to some others. And also for our audience, please let me know if there's a question in the Q&A box. We've been talking about different contexts, right? We've talked about the biodiversity protection 30-30. We've been talking about equity. We've been talking about how do we, as we move forward into the next century, have our care of nature be a dominant paradigm of just how we live in this world. So when you think about innovation and you think about our field of landscape stewardship and conservation, where do you think are the greatest opportunities? And what scale do you think we should focus on with those opportunities? And I'm going to start with you, Annie, being kind of close in our region. How would you approach that question?
Am I going first? Because are we going in alphabetical order? I just start all of the time? Oh God, I think I'm so excited actually by what's going on in the world. It's a little, with a lot of respect to that it's not easy for a lot of people right now. There's a lot of pain and a lot of hurt. So I don't mean to be excited. I don't mean to be callous to their pain. But I think there's so much up in the air right now that why not help things land in the way that we know is right. And I think when I think of innovation and opportunities, I really think of investing in the public commons. And really, I think our field of stewardship and conservation needs to do more to understand what the public means in the public commons. So we talk about clean air, clean water, and those certainly are part of the public commons, but also what part of the public are we really talking about? So I think this is this is the time to really dig in to understanding what role we have, and we all have a role in systemic racism and social inequities, and what role do we have, what privileges do we have, what responsibilities do we have, to really understanding the public part of public commons, and to invest more in the people and in the lands. So I think there's a lot that we can do right now, and that some of the barriers that we've had in the certain kind of frameworks that we've been working within for years, have dissolved or erupted, depending on which one they are. And I think it's a golden opportunity to think critically, creatively, and meaningfully about the work that we want to do.
Mm. And I get that from your answer. That's pretty much all scales, not just in the region.
I think thank you. That's a really good point, because I think when we, especially talking about racism, I think we have to start the scale of one. I mean, that's internal work. And so it is the work that we need to do, I think, is from the individual to global. It really is at all scales.
How about you, Jay? Thinking of the state scale, when you think of innovation and opportunity?
The first thing I want to do is just acknowledge Annie's comment there. I mean, it's so powerful. I mean, I think the true answer is I don't know. But I have to be open, and we all have to be open to this moment, and being really forthright and honest about the conversations we're having in society, and reflecting on how that might affect what we've taken as truths for our whole careers. So I think openness is the greatest opportunity. But I think to your question about the state level and scale, I think and when I say we, I mean practitioners in these networks. And I'm thinking about the national network, the international conversation James was talking about, the local networks that are being organized in the Bay Area as an example, and statewide networks. We are the conveners of those conversations. And we are going to have to align our work and provide the scaffolding for that whole of that rebuilding of the next phase of this effort. I mean, I know that sounds really crazily big, but we have to help our political leaders understand the work to be done. We have to help them understand the investment frameworks that can guide it. And we have to provide that support for local groups that are making this transformation. I really don't think any of us know exactly what the next most important thing is, but all of these things are vital conversations. And I, again, just appreciate you convening this conversation so that we can continue to invest in that.
Mm. Thank you, Jay. Yes, openness to the unknown, right? But also providing the scaffolding to let it emerge. I really appreciate that. Gary, your perspectives.
Well, let's go with the givens. One, we have to do this work at large scale because that's the nature of the threat, whether it's climate change or loss of biodiversity or pollution, or the way we're, tearing up the biosphere. We have to work at the scale. We have to work through, and networks are the only way in a cost-effective manner that's going to be able to do this. So that's a given. The other thing is that one of the reasons I work in ecological connectivity conservation is that all lands and seas have conservation value. We can't just place conservation within protected areas. In fact, the biosphere won't work unless we have these other areas protected. And hence connectivity is not only an ecological process, it's a human process because you have to talk to people across geographies and cultures. And that's what is the framework, the fabric that sews us all together as humanity to work to steward the entire planet. But in terms of, the innovations, well, one of the things I'd like to see in innovation, when we talk about diversity, diversity can be for some a fragmenting word. And I want diversity to be said in the context of unity, and that we want to bring all these diverse interests together to work together to save the planet that's under intense threat. If we continue to make diversity a fragmenting force, then it will serve us no well in this process. It has to be a unifying force. Let me just talk about health. I look at the environment in a health lens, and all too often, our colleagues and ourselves, we place it down in a lower importance in society. And I think that nature, whether it's our access to nature, is a healthy element. But there's also another thing that's emerging in the scientific world, that intact nature, that the ecological functions that work in nature not only sustain nature, it sustains us. And we don't pay enough attention in making nature a health issue. We really do injustice by devaluating it. And then finally, I'm so grateful for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, but I wish we had a Land and Water Conservation Fund for the stewardship world. So, I have paid attention. My wife is Australian, and my mother-in-law works for Land Care in Australia. And it gets it's a social movement to get people to think about land conservation as part of any kind of community volunteer work that they would do. And years it struggles for money, and some years it doesn't struggle for money. But the main thing, it does need money to support this kind of stewardship. And we don't have a stewardship fund, if you will. And it would be great in terms of our innovation and policy, we could create some level of stewardship. And it may have to come at a county level or state level before a nation takes on this task. But if we really are serious about stewardship, because the scale is big, we need a Land and Water Conservation Fund to support stewardship.
I couldn't agree with you more, Gary. That's music to my ears. So thank you for that very impassioned plea. I think I'm going to take that snippet. I'm going to play it at all state leadership in California. How about you, Jim? When you think of at an international scale, innovation.
Yeah, very, very good question. So it reminds me of a theme that I've written about a little bit, which is that if you think back about 120 years, or around the time that Teddy Roosevelt was president, the great philanthropists and networkers, especially networkers, who were shaping the face of the earth were Rockefeller, Carnegie, the Bell Network, a lot of energy and telecommunications companies and railroads that were based on the eastern seaboard of the United States. If you look at it today, for better or worse, Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, Tesla, Apple, Google, I would say, I haven't tried to count it, but a ridiculous proportion of the most valuable industrial companies in the world are within 200 miles of where you're sitting right now, maybe 300. And that those companies and the culture that they're building and the networks that we're speaking over right now are going to shape the way that the world works over the next 50 years. So you're sitting in California in exactly the place that this culture of the future is going to be created, whether or not you're friends with the people at Google and so on. So I would say that embrace the place that you are, because there's crazy innovation going around the block from your office or your house. And second, there's a very elemental thing that we can all do that's both local and global. Right now, there's something called the World Database for Protected Areas. It's run by the IUCN and the United Nations. It counts the number of protected areas in the world. That database has just opened for land protected by the private and civic sectors to also be counted. That is, the land trusts and the national trusts and the organizations of every kind that we find on all 6 continents. They now have an opportunity with shapefiles and a descriptor file to be counted in the global count and to get to 30 by 30. If all of us work locally to make sure that our protected areas that we love are counted on a global basis, we're going to inch that count forward until it becomes unstoppable. So I would say do the nerdy act of making sure that the property that you care about, that all of the parcels on Mount Tam, for example, are counted in that global database so that we can say, absolutely, we can have good livelihoods and beautiful nature at the same time, but we have to do it in a systematic way. So that's my vote.
Thanks, Jim. And Lisa, do you want to close it out with your thoughts? And then I'm going to turn it to some of our participants, their questions. But what about you when you think about innovation and the greatest opportunities?
Yeah, happy to clean up on all those amazing thoughts and comments. So I want to echo and build on what everybody said. So one of the things is scale, and I think in terms of scale, it really needs to operate at all scales. So Cliff talks about scales defined by human values in addition to land values. What's my story? And so I think the scale starts at what scale you can perceive. So Gary and Jim, you're working with massive, large scale, you can comprehend that. There are people that can only comprehend, Jim, the piece of properties that you were just talking about on Mount Tam, And so whatever scale, it does have to be that large scale, but it also starts individually. I also think about, for me, ultimately, so Gary, you talked about health, and for me, ultimately, this work is about resilience. And so, boy, we're seeing that right now on so many fronts. And it's the ecological resilience, it's the sociological resilience, it's the individual resilience. So at the community, at the individual, and Annie, as you said, that's our work. That's what we have to do. It's the individual, it's the community, it's the ecosystem levels in terms of that. And so I think that scale is important, and scale needs to work. And we need to not put people in certain boxes in terms of scale. We need to allow them to work at that scale, because it really is, Jim, you're just talking about that global database. It's when we knit it together that we're really doing work. And then I also want to touch on the funding piece in terms of the innovation piece that people have said. So I've been doing this work for 25 years now, and I've talked to funders of all kinds, and we do a lot of funneling of money to on-the-ground projects for stewardship work. And we have funders say to us, and this also came up in the Q&A too, so I want to address some of that too, is that some people will say, this is what we love, this networked approach, this is what we talk about wanting to fund in our boardrooms. but we don't have a bucket to put you in because our funding priorities, the way that we've lined them up, don't line up to that work right now. Or they say, boy, I just can't. I mean, there's so many environmental projects, how do I know what's a good one? And so we who are doing this work know that answer, and we know where that fund can go. And so after having done this for 25 years, I've said, I want the Stewardship Network to become the Stewardship Network and fund. I know that people they love to fund protection because it is, Jim, as you said, it's forever, but it's not forever if we don't take care of it. It loses the ecological and cultural value that made it valuable in the first place. So we have to steward that land. And that's what the Stewardship Network is all about. So we know stewardship intimately, we know it at all scales. And so I'm actually gonna start that work to see if we can go that road. And sounds like, Gary, we should be having a conversation about this and the others. And I just think it's really critical that the resource constraint just shouldn't be there. And there's money out there in the world. The resources are there. We just need to find them and move them towards stewardship.
Yes, thank you. I put you last for that very reason. You're so good, Lisa, for bringing all those thoughts. But I agree with you and Gary. This concept of a stewardship fund, all that way. I mean, when we talk about it, it's reciprocating, right? The fund can be used to help take care of nature, and nature helps take care of us. And I think that in this moment in time, and over the last decade, I've seen more and more overt conversations around just that. I mean, as a side note, I did my graduate work on looking at the recreational value of ecological stewardship. And over 90% of those people who participate in some level of volunteerism, I self-identify as a recreational experience, giving them that value. So thank you. So I'm going to turn it to some of our participants' questions, and some of them you touched upon, but I want to get to, Gary, when you began your introduction, I mean, the fact that you facilitate and support a large number of networks. I think you said 11. And Lisa, you were talking about the Stewardship Fund. And this question is really it's from Stu, and it's around capacity. Gary, you talked about, you took an idea, it was funded for 4 years, and now look, almost a decade plus later, like, how do we sustain capacity or build capacity for networks and for stewardship, from expertise to innovation to funding? And what are your thoughts as you reflect? Other than you're going to partner with Lisa and we're going to have a stewardship fund in the next month.
Well, I mean, so how are you going to sustain it? Well, it must be real work, it must be authentic, and it must be an appetite for the work. That's how these things, start up. And I used to be a funder. I used to work in philanthropy, and we would have what I would call philanthropic created partnerships that would fall apart as soon as the funder left, because the funder had some kind of strategic planning goal that they had for their foundation, and then they'd fund it to make it work, and then it'd fall apart. And then I realized, well, that's not going to work, and let's not do that. So it is a challenge to sustain these networks. But here's the thing, is that, and this has to get into our nonprofit mentality of how we design nonprofits. A lot of nonprofits just grow to grow. Some have become Walmarts of nonprofits, and I'm not going to say who they are. But instead of having that capacity under one roof, isn't there ways to do distributed capacity amongst many nonprofits to do the same work? There's a lot of duplication. There's a lot of inefficiencies. And I believe one of the elements of that networks are getting at is in those inefficiencies that are happening within the nonprofit sector. And that is more cost effective in how you do this work. So just the nature of the work itself and how we do it has some cost benefits, and it's cheaper to get done for the same kind of value. Doesn't mean you don't need resources, you do. But in order to keep people at the table, again, you have to, they have to have an appetite.
Thank you. I love the term you use, distributive capacity. I mean, I think a lot about networks and how they amplify the nodes within a network, right? I mean, that's when we know we're doing our work well, when both the individual and the collective is able to perform at levels that they didn't think that they could. I want to take this question and go a little deeper. So Lou asked a question about the future of private markets and how they might support stewardship work, whether it's environmental impact bonds or carbon capture projects. And Jay, I want to turn that one to you to see if you or maybe Jim have some thoughts on this question.
Well, and I can kick it over to Jim pretty quickly to hear more of the examples. But I mean, I think, to a certain extent, California has, created a really robust market structure around investments that come from our cap and trade program, from reducing our greenhouse gas footprint. And that, it's seemingly a successful model. I think I think it's always going to be a challenge when there's a revenue source being generated to ensure that that doesn't become politicized. But I think, the example is there for everyone to see. How can we take revenue from greenhouse gas reductions and invest that in wildfire risk reduction that, by the way, also enhances carbon sequestration? And so I think no matter, and this isn't just my bias because I sit in a government chair, but I think government has to play a role in brokering that and identifying the goods and identifying the landing zones for those really, really meaningful investments. It seems that's how it strikes me based on the sort of front row seat we've had here on this investment strategy. But I would love to hear from other examples.
Thanks, Jay.
Sharon, I would love to add to that. I think that the point about the cap and trade in California is a very, very important point, because it's taken a lot of deep institutional work and work with capital markets and work with serious financial engineering to get that thing up and running. And it is up and running now, and it is a global model that's successful. There are lots of innovations going along in this field of conservation finance, and some of them are in California, some are in the East Coast, some are in Europe, but quantified ventures, blue forests, the emergence of a multi-billion going to trillion-dollar market in green bonds, impact investments that return capital and income to their investors. All of these things take institutions that are willing to act as long-term fiduciaries and who are willing to take administrative ownership of the projects. That's beyond simply coordination and having good discussions. That's institution building. And my guess is that over the next 50 to 100 years, we're going to see a whole ecosystem of institutions who have fiduciary responsibility for stewardship and who have accounting and marketing and HR and all of those things that big institutions have, and some of them will do their jobs exceedingly well. So that, I think, is that's a big part of the future, and I think that's something that people who plan for this kind of stuff have to think about now so that we can get to that point in 20 years.
Thanks, Jim. I've got time for one more question. This one's actually come to me via text. So this question is a good question, I think, for this moment in time. The question is basically, we have, and you have outlined, there are really amazing opportunities in front of us. However, most of what we're doing right now depends upon a certain level of digital connectivity and hardware that not everybody has. What can we do so that the existing digital divide doesn't widen and that it doesn't further exclude some of the communities and stakeholders that we want to connect with? And I think this is a really important question in this moment. And I'm wondering, Gary, you're nodding your head vigorously. For yourself and maybe Annie, if you want to touch upon this, and then we can go ahead.
So, I mean, this is a key question because we work with a lot of tribes in Montana. We work with 4 major tribes. And 1, the tribes are in lockdown. 2, you can't have these kind of calls with the tribes. And if you want to work with the tribes, you've got to go visit the tribes. One of the biggest things I train millennials, or now the pre-millennials, because I'm getting older, is can you learn how to dial a phone, or can you go out and meet people? You can't just rely on email to get this done. I think there are some structural things that are evolving as we, take on these new technologies. So yes, there is a digital divide, and it is, and you're going to have to still work with different ways with different cultures. You can't get around that. But the one thing is that people do work better if you go out and make the personal, social connection.
And that is so hard to do right now, but it's such an important point. Annie, is there anything you want to add to that?
Just real quick, I'd add that I think we all are incredibly aware of how interconnected we all are. And so we're not little islands of my house is different than the house next door kind of thing. I mean, we really are so interconnected. And so if we want to move forward as a species, we need to bring everyone with us. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity, again, to think critically and creatively about how we connect with everyone, and make sure that people of all abilities, all socioeconomic levels are with us, and moving forward together.
Well,
And then Sharon, can I just jump in real quick on that too? One of the things to build on both of what you two have just said, I think one of the other things that's going to happen is we've talked about the different unintended consequences from these crises that are going to happen. And I do hope that one of the unintended consequences, as schools are going digital and as school districts are spending money to get people connected, that that in some way, in addition to doing the things that Gary, you talked about, and Annie, you were talking about, but that some of that digital gap may be narrowed a little bit as we're connecting these school children, and workplaces are making connections for people that they work with. That said, it's a huge gap to narrow.
Thank you, Lisa. And just closing, since we have like 2 minutes left, I feel like one of the things that was so apparent in this conversation is connectivity, right? We've talked about connectivity around people. We've talked about connectivity around place and wildlife corridors and networks being a vehicle for building connectivity. And when we conceived this panel, part of it for me was to bring into one place multiple scales. And I really feel that part of the future of stewardship is connecting all of these different scales. I go to a lot of conversations, which I think you do, where we're very high up. We're talking the international level, or we're talking the kind of grassroots. Annie, you said your backyard. And we have so much to learn from each other and also to amplify within each other's work. So I just want to thank all of our panelists joining today, because what you do is so important and so incredible. And the fact that you took time out of your busy schedules to join us for this series, I just want to say with deep gratitude, thank you for everything you contributed to this conversation. And Gary and Lisa, I look forward to applying for my first grant from the two of you for the Stewardship Fund, hopefully January, not putting too much pressure.
Let's go, Gary. Time's a wasting.
Anyway, I also just want to thank our participants for joining, our audience. This, again, for many of you who are familiar with the California Landscape Stewardship Network, this series sadly replaced our in-person convening, but it's really brought incredible opportunities we didn't really envision. Our next one is on the 16th of September, where we're going to have a conversation on stewardship, stimulus, and social distancing. We've learned a lot from working with COVID, and a lot of best practices, whether it be around fuels management, whether it be about biodiversity monitoring, whether it be around pulling weeds. And so this will be a chance to come together around the state and talk about what have we learned, what do we want to carry forward, and how can we build upon our collective learning. So again, thank you all for joining us today. We always welcome comments. Please take time to fill out the evaluation that will be coming. And again, participants and panelists, thank you so much. And I hope you have a great rest of the week. Take care.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.